Welcome to the History Guy podcast, Counterfactuals. What is a counterfactual? In the context of studying history, it is a kind of analysis where we examine what might have happened had historical events gone differently. As a thought experiment, the goal is to learn and understand history as it is by talking about what it could have been. As a twist on the historical stories that we tell on the History Guy YouTube channel, this is a series of podcasts that dwell on that eternal question: what if? I'm Josh, a writer for the YouTube channel and son of the History Guy. If you're a fan of the channel, you already know Lance, the History Guy himself. To liven up our discussions on what might have happened, we have invited Brad Wagnon, history aficionado and a longtime friend of the History Guy, to join us. Remember that if you'd like to support us, you can find us on Patreon, YouTube, and locals.com. Join us as we discuss what deserves to be remembered and what might have been. On today's episode, we talk about calendars, specifically the Gregorian calendar, and how and why it became the calendar we all use today. What does that calendar mean to us, and what might it mean if we used a different one? Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
Here's an interesting question of historical trivia. What important historical event occurred on September 5th of 1752 in England? If you don't immediately know, you can try to divine it from the period. George II was King of England. Henry Pelham was Prime Minister. England was not technically at war, but they were conducting a proxy war against the French on the Indian subcontinent. And in the colonies, Ben Franklin conducted his famous electricity experiment with his kite earlier in the year in 1752. And if you still don't know what important event happened on September 5th, it's in fact a trick question. No historical events of any importance occurred in England on September 5th of 1752, and we know that because there was no September 5th in England in 1752. And the reason why is a story that deserves to be remembered. There's archaeological evidence that people had methods of keeping time based on the lunar cycles as far back as the Neolithic period. In 2013, archaeologists discovered a group of pits in Aberdeenshire in England that appear to correspond with the phases of the moon that dates back some 10,000 years, and may be the world's oldest known lunar calendar, although there is some dispute over that claim. As the phases of the moon are easy to observe, they serve as an effective method of tracking time, and lunar calendars are still used today by some cultures to determine religious holidays. And while it makes sense to track time based on the phases of the moon, there is a problem, as the moon is not in sync with the sun, and thus 12 lunar periods is only 354 days, well short of a solar year, the period of time required for the Earth to make one complete revolution around the sun. The problem is that tracking time by the moon means that lunar months will cycle through the seasons, making a lunar calendar a poor tool regarding one of the most important reasons to track months: agriculture. The problem is usually addressed through a process called intercalation, in which additional days are added in order to sync a lunar calendar with the seasons. Since a solar year does not include a whole number of lunar months, most so-called lunisolar calendars count 12 lunar months as a year, but add an additional month every 2 or 3 years in order to resync the calendar with the seasons, and thus different years will have different numbers of days. There are various methods of intercalation used for lunisolar calendars, although the one used by the Banks Islands of Vanuatu, based on the spawning cycle of the Pololo worm, is perhaps the most interesting. The early Roman calendar was such a lunar solar calendar. The Romans tried to synchronize the months with the first crescent moon following a new moon, resulting in some months of 29 days and some months more. They then used intercalation to sync the calendar. Every other year they would shorten February and add a leap month, or intercalaris. The process is still the reason that February has 28 days on the modern calendar. Roman debts were typically due on the first of each month, called the calendae, and payments were tracked in a ledger book called the calendarium, which is the genesis of the term calendar. But the process was still imperfect, adding approximately 4 days every 4 years too much to be in line with the solar year. And of course, over time that would show, as the calendar would no longer be in sync with the seasons. So in 46 BC, Julius Caesar consulted a Greek astronomer named Sosigenes of Alexandria to create a better calendar. The new calendar divided a 365-day year into 12 months, with some months 31 days and some 30, but retaining the shortened 28-day February. But an intercalation was still required to keep the calendar in sync, and so one additional day was added to February every 4 years. The so-called Julian calendar was used by edict throughout the empire, but it still had a flaw. The average length of a year on the Julian calendar is 365.25 days. But a solar year is actually slightly shorter, 365.2425 days, a difference of 3 days every 400 years, or about 0.2%. That seems small, but over enough time it became a problem, and was most noticeable in terms of a specific religious holiday, Easter. Easter is the most important Christian feast, and its date traditionally was determined based on a solar event, the vernal equinox. But the date was actually fixed by the calendar, and Caesar's 0.2% discrepancy meant that over 1600 years later, Easter was no longer landing where Easter had traditionally been celebrated by early Christians relative to the vernal equinox. And so, in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced a calendar reform called the Gregorian Calendar that adjusted the Julian calendar so that rather than a leap year every 4 years, every year that was exactly divisible by 4 would be a leap year, except for years that were exactly divisible by 100. But those centurial years are leap years if they are exactly divisible by 400. And so, for example, the year 2000 should have been a leap year because 2000 is evenly divisible by 4, but should not have been a leap year because 2000 is evenly divisible by 100, but was a leap year because 2000 is evenly divisible by 400. The Gregorian calendar is the calendar most commonly used, at least for civil purposes, throughout the world today. But there was still a problem. In 1501, King Henry VII of England's oldest son, Arthur, the Prince of Wales, married Catherine of Aragon, the youngest surviving child of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile. The goal of the marriage was to cement an alliance between England and Spain, but just 20 weeks after being married, Arthur died of a sweating sickness. Still trying to make a marital alliance with Spain, Henry VII betrothed his dead son's bride to his second son, Henry, just 11 years old, although the two did not actually marry until 1509 after Henry ascended to the throne as Henry VIII following his father's death. But by 1525, Henry had become frustrated as he and Catherine had failed to produce a male heir. One son had died after just 7 weeks, and 2 more had been stillborn. Moreover, Henry had fallen in love with another woman, Anne Boleyn, who refused to be seduced so long as she could not be queen. That prompted Henry to seek an annulment from the Pope, Pope Clement VII, claiming that his marriage was blighted in the eyes of God because Catherine had been his brother's widow. The Pope refused on multiple grounds, one of which might well have been that following the sack of Rome in 1527, the Pope was being held prisoner by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who happened to be Catherine of Aragon's nephew. Frustrated, Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn anyway in 1533, and the Pope responded by excommunicating Henry, causing England to break with the Roman Catholic Church and establish the Independent Church of England in 1534. And England and the Pope were still not on good terms 48 years later, when Pope Gregory changed the calendar. While the Gregorian calendar became Catholic canon via a papal bull in 1582, most Protestant nations, like England, thumbed their nose at Gregory and continued on with the Julian calendar. In fact, Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, briefly considered adopting a similar reform, but gave up under opposition from Anglican church bishops who argued that the Pope was, literally, the biblical fourth great beast of Daniel. The split was still an issue in 1754. Understand that George II was only king because in his grandmother's time, 50 Catholics who were higher in line for the throne had been excluded based on acts of parliament that restricted the royal succession to Protestants. But much of the rest of Europe had switched in the intervening time, including the other half of the United Kingdom, Scotland, which had moved to the Gregorian calendar under King James VI in 1600. And Parliament complained that because of the discrepancy in dates between England and most of her neighbors, frequent mistakes are occasioned in the dates of deeds and other writings, and disputes arise therefrom. And so the Calendar Act of 1750 moved England to what was, in effect, the Gregorian calendar without actually using that name. To facilitate the change and sync with their neighbors, 11 days had to be removed from the calendar in 1752 to account for the effect of nearly 18 centuries of Julius Caesar's 0.2% miscalculation. Citizens of England went to bed on September 2nd, 1752, and woke up the next day on September 14th. Nothing happened on September 5th, because there was no September 5th. In addition to moving England to the Gregorian calendar, the Calendar Act of 1750 also made the official start of the New Year in England January 1st. Prior to the Calendar Act, the New Year actually started in England on March 25th. There has been some historical argument that there were riots based on the Calendar Act, that people were in the streets shouting, "Give us back our lost 11 days." But most historians agree now that no riots occurred, and that myth started because of a misunderstanding of some political satire that was written to make fun of Tories who tried to make the calendar reform an issue in the election of 1755. England was by no means the last country to move to the Gregorian calendar. Sweden, for example, tried to start moving gradually, starting in 1700 and taking out a day a year. But that resulted in a period where they were off of both the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar, and so they gave that up. And they didn't end up making the change actually until a year after England, when in 1753 they just made a short February. Many Eastern European countries didn't actually make the move until the 20th century. In Russia, for example, the move was not made until after the October Revolution of 1917. And ironically, when the dates are adjusted, the October Revolution didn't occur until November. Some nations today still use the Julian calendar to determine things like religious holidays, but use the Gregorian calendar for civil business. Notably, former Protestant and Orthodox countries adopted the solar part of the Gregorian calendar, but they rejected the lunar part, which was used to determine the date of Easter. Instead, they use a completely different calculation that comes to the exact same answer, but doesn't give credit to a Catholic pope. And while it might seem a historical triviality to say that nothing happened in England between September 4th and September 13th of 1752 because they skipped those 11 days, it is undoubtedly extremely useful that despite all our other disagreements, the vast majority of the world at least agrees on today's date.
Now for the fun part, where I, the history guy himself, and longtime friend of the history guy Brad Wagnon, discuss what might have happened if it had all gone differently. So the episode that we're talking about today is specifically about the 1750 Calendar Act, which is about when England switched to the Gregorian calendar. But I think that the best discussion here is talking about the Gregorian calendar kind of in general. We can talk about, what if only England didn't switch back. But I think there were lots of countries that switched afterward. There were lots of countries that switched at various times between 1582 and 1750. And there's a handful of countries today that still don't like using it. But everyone uses it more or less as a civil calendar. I think that it's a really interesting discussion because this is, when you look into why the Gregorian calendar is the one that is the one we all use, the reasoning seems to be it's the one that the Europeans were using, and they happens to be the influential one as they colonized around the world. And so we all just kind of adopted the Gregorian calendar because it was the convenient one. And so it's an interesting question to say if the Europeans had not chosen the Gregorian calendar, or if some other power had a more convenient calendar or something like that. I mean, I think we could have a very different calendar.
There's a cultural connection with the calendar. It seems like it would just be about, spinning planet. But there's a cultural connection with the calendar, and part of the argument of the westernization of culture is that the world seems to have gone with the Gregorian calendar as the method for counting. And so what if we had gone with a Jewish calendar? What if we'd gone with a Chinese lunar calendar? And there were experiments around the turn of the century to move to a scientific-based calendar that removed that whole cultural influence from it. And those calendars would be interesting as well. I mean, it was proposed both to the United Nations and to the League of Nations, were new modern calendars too. So I think that it's an interesting discussion to say, what if we simply came up with a different calendar? I think there might be historically some discussion of what if England had chosen not to go. I mean, we're still off with Scotland. I mean, that was a question that they had going for a long time. But I think that's a relatively minor discussion in that everybody sort of crawled their way over to the Gregorian calendar. What if we'd gone to something else? Or what if we had never agreed on a calendar? What if the world kept doing what we were doing before?
Yeah, I do think that one of the things about the Gregorian calendar is it just works. And so it does a very, very good job of keeping the 365.224 days per year, or hours in a day, days per year, everything lined up more or less correctly. Yes, there is a little bit of variation that you do have to correct every few years.
Well, yeah,
but it was
every year that is divisible by 4, except years that are divisible by 100, except for years that are divisible by 400. But I mean, that's a necessary math. But if you had something like the International Fixed Calendar or the World Calendar, then you would have all the months would be the same.
Yeah.
I mean, you're going to have I mean, in the world calendar, every quarter has 3 months, one with 30, one with 28, one with 29,
Yeah.
right? But and then you have an extra day that instead of throwing in an extra day in February, it's just like an extra day. So I mean, there are other calendars that would be correct to keep up with the divergence between the Earth spinning on its axis and the Earth rotating around the sun. I mean, this is the Gregorian calendar is not the only one that does that, but certainly if we had stuck with a Julian calendar, right, then we would be off by, I mean, quite a lot of time. And the Easter would be coming in what is like May, and how much would that change the world?
Yeah,
It's an interesting
I
question.
do think that part of the conflict, of course, and the reason that England held out for so long was that it was perceived that this was some sort of a Catholic conspiracy to try to wean England away from those bad Protestants and bring them back into the fold.
Yeah, it was Protestant countries who didn't want to do what the Pope said. I mean, it came from a papal bull. It was named after a pope.
Well, some of the Eastern Orthodox stuff, or those Eastern Orthodox churches still essentially have found a way around it where they don't have to. Yeah, we're not following the Pope, even though the Pope was maybe in this.
Yeah,
this way,
for figuring
right?
Easter, they just came up with a different calculation to come up with Easter on the same date. Yeah, so that it's not the way that the Pope came to Easter. And there's Easter is the first full moon after the vernal equinox, right? So.
Yeah.
Or the day after, the Sunday after, the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. That's Easter.
Seems a little convoluted, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, that's a predictable date, though. But say, like in North America, Native Americans in North America, or indigenous peoples, or whatever name you want to use, and there was no agreement. There wasn't a singular calendar that was used. But I mean, you just essentially followed seasons, natural seasons. But I mean, they knew when the equinoxes were. They were we were able to track from there. It just didn't bother them that sometimes they didn't count months. But I mean, it didn't bother them that some months might be longer than some other month. And the Romans prior to the Julian calendar, I mean, they would just use a lunar calendar and they would just throw in extra. We're going to have an extra month this year or whatever. And every year they would just decide. Now, that's if as a world we agreed upon that, then it might be hard to figure out when your birthday is. But I mean, we would all agree that today is March 31st.
Well, and truthfully, I mean, that's the calendar ultimately, like many things that humans come up with, is just our attempt to impose order on something that's going to happen, whether or not we have days and weeks and months and names for everything. But in terms of, something like you're trying to run an empire or a business, it's rather important that we have dates. And it'd be hard to imagine the modern world running the way it does without us all agreeing on dates. It's hard to sign contracts.
It's hard to figure out delivery. But I mean, that says, would we have a different modern world? So we have a modern world that is very much tied to dates and says this will deliver, Amazon says it's going to deliver in 2 days. Our contract starts in 2 days or whatever. We give a date, the contract lasts for X period of time, all that stuff. We sort of write it down. But I mean, in terms of time, I mean, some cultures, you got to be right on time. And some cultures are very loose on, it comes around the time that you schedule. And everybody operates. So if we hadn't chosen to go to a calendar with very precise dates, might the way that we organize the modern world be different? And how different would we be?
Does it reflect? Because of course there's reflections both ways. Is that how much does the calendar reflect the culture it was built in, and how much have we kind of built our culture around the calendar that we made? And that's true. Is that we are very it's very important to us that in the Western world for the most, well, even that's not necessarily true across the whole thing. People in Spain are not necessarily as it might be interested in exact times
as people in Japan. But I mean, depending on the job that I have, I mean, sometimes a day of the week is the most important thing, and sometimes I'm like, oh, is it Wednesday? I forgot. I don't keep track of such things, So
right, and we easily could have done. I mean, we've got week. Our week is 7 days. That's not necessarily the way we had to do it. I mean, there are calendars that run in different lengths of time, and I think it's hard for us to even imagine a non 7 day week cycle. That's just how we've done it.
Done it, yeah. And
everyone's done it that way.
There's nothing natural to 7 days. I mean, that's just something that we
Not
make
really.
up. But I mean, one of the complaints about things like the world calendar or the international fixed calendar is that there will be a couple of days every year that are not counted in a week. You have 2 Sundays in a row, or you have, and that is a problem for some religions that really count on 7-day weeks, where a Seventh-day Adventist, or the Muslim religion, the Jewish religion, and the Christian religion all venerate certain days in the week, figuring on a 7-day week. So, is that all thrown off if you have that extra day there? But I mean, again, that's we built that culturally. I mean, were we doing that before we had a calendar, or were we just kind of eeny, meeny, miny, mowing on what day of the week it was? How would we order the world differently if we just never agreed on a calendar? I mean, what we find out from people before the Julian calendar is that you can figure out when to plant your crops without keeping exact match on the date. You can figure out when Easter is without counting dates, just because the vernal equinox, which is something that you can astronomically observe. So might we be a different sort of people? Would we still be accomplished, but would we accomplish differently if we didn't all have this idea that we have to be agreed on the date?
I'm pretty sure that the entire 7-day week was in fact imposed upon us by the British, as Napoleon famous referred to them, that nation of shopkeepers, so that they could keep their their pay books straight. But all joking aside, it is incredibly important for in a truly modern society, especially with the technological level that we're at. It actually, fractions of seconds are important. And it is interesting that in 1750, it was degrees of days that were...
because we couldn't measure accurately to the fraction of a second. So could we not be doing all the stuff we're doing if we weren't measuring to the fraction of seconds, or would we simply be doing it differently? I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me, I did a little short once on the SS Warramoo, which they actually did this on the SS. It's maybe a real story. There's some question of whether it is, but it's and it's headed to Australia at 1900 on the January 1st, 1900. So they go park on the international date line as they cross the equator. So you got these 2 lines, right? And so you got the boat, and part of the boat is in the 20th or the 19th century. Part of the boat is in the 20th century. Part of the boat is in January. Part of the boat is in December. Part of the boat is in the northern hemisphere. Part of the boat is in the southern hemisphere. All that if you're parked on that. But I mean, those are all just artificial lines that we make up. That spot, the fish in that spot in the ocean doesn't care. Yeah. Right. So it just shows we've created all this fabrication. So what are the odds that they could in 1900 actually park their boat in that right spot accurately? Because we didn't have GPS. I mean, would we be on station, or does it even matter if we're not on station, if that's the best way we have to measure stations, since all those lines are just made up anyway? And of course, there's the problem that they did that in 1900 when actually technically the 20th century doesn't start until 1901. 1900 is part of the 18th or the 19th century, not the 20th century. So I mean, it's funny when you put that up, because you've got this whole thing. It's got almost this gag that says if you're parked in the right spot at the right time, then you can be. I mean, if you're across the date line, right? You're in 2 different days. You could straddle the date line, and there are places where you can literally straddle the equator and be in both the northern and the southern hemisphere at 2 different times. But that is all just stuff that we made up. It's all stuff that is artificial lines on a map. That make no more sense to the fish in the sea than anything else. The fish in the sea managed to live without knowing what date it is. So it's an interesting question. I mean, it's maybe a broader question we're saying here, because it's not whether we adopted the Gregorian calendar. It's even if we just chose not to adopt a calendar. I mean, if we just operated by lunar cycles like we did prior to a calendar, that roughly don't quite measure a year, and so every now and again we just say, oh, we got 3 extra days this week, and we have a festival that week, and that's how we're way that fine. Easter's not not going off in May.
And then when we make a contract or a deal or something like that, we figure, we'll do it around this time, and kind of when everyone's ready. That's what we'll do it. And that's, I mean, it's certainly like you could run a society that way. It would be a very different society than ours. Because, I mean, gosh, in order for us to say, Like, is it necessary for us to have all of the rules and the calendar for us to be able to move stuff from all over the world to one place? Like, that's how, when you order something on Amazon, I mean, the number of steps that all the raw materials and everything, and the number of countries it all had to go through, and factories and people to get to you, was reliant on all these these frameworks of things that we all made up.
But those are all opportunities to miss a date. I mean, those are all
that's
opportunities
also
where
true.
something's late, right? So I mean, if it turns out that piece is late, I mean, they just they send it to you another day, right?
That's true. And how much does that eventually? Sometimes you don't get the thing you need on at the time you want. But
I mean, we can no longer float checks like we used to float checks or whatever, where the date on the check means so much. But I mean, which was really kind of the reason that England changed, just because you couldn't make Scotland and England were on different days, even though they were doing business with each other. But I mean,
it does show how important. I mean, talking about how important the calendar is. I mean, the stuff that determined how this calendar worked and why we changed calendars was stuff like religion, which was, of course, very important to all the people who were practicing, and it was very important when Easter was held. And also, it shows us, the importance of the things like business, and that the countries are able to work together, because without that, it does start to kind of put this problem between our functioning world. Mm-hmm. The world functions differently if you don't all run on the same calendar and at the same time. And that's why Scotland and England are having that problem. We could have had that problem with everybody else. And if we were all running on different calendars, which certainly is not impossible to imagine, would that be total chaos? Or would we all just time zones, you figure out
kind of run on both calendars. They use the Gregorian calendar for international business, but they still use their lunar calendar to decide their religious dates and stuff. And the religions don't seem to collapse with that. I mean, that's what religion was doing for 1,000 years before the Julian calendar came along, right? So this is interesting, is that I saw, and I honestly don't know how much of this is true, but I saw an article in Science magazine talking about how deer are actually democratic. And what they're talking about is how does the herd decide when it's time to migrate, when it's time to move? And as they start poking their head up and looking, it's the point that it shifts to more than half are looking, all of a sudden they will all go. And that is to say that even, I mean, in nature, there is some sort of, basic idea where everybody kind of looks at each other and says, okay, it's time to go. Could we operate that way? Could we? And if we did, if instead of, it is March 31st, if instead we operated by a lunar calendar or the general seasonal calendar, and then we all just sort of looked at each other based on our experience that it's time to plant crops, could we all still eat? And how different might we be as a people? Might we as a people be less warlike? Might we as a people be more able to come to agreements on things? Or does a calendar make it easier for us to have conflict?
That's interesting. Certainly, you can all know, we all know a person who's so caught up in the technicalities of something that they cause issues. That it's so important that it's we're running on whatever of the deals and the exact minutes and exactly all the rules, and does that cause friction? Whereas if we were all just kind of, as opposed to paying attention to all of our very technical details that we've all made up, if we were more like go with the flow, like the deer, which is they're like, oh, when do we go? Well, when we all feel like it.
Yeah, we all look at each other, and then at some point we would be able to make a decision. I mean, humans have been around for as long as at least 100,000 years. The calendar has been around for a couple of thousand. And so, I mean, for some good deal of time, we didn't seem to need that. But I mean, there are versions of it. I mean, there's a bone piece that's Neolithic that shows him carving the phases of the moon. So at least he's understanding something with a lunar calendar or something at that point. But I mean, we seem to operate in fairly, I mean, Ötzi, the Iceman, has some pretty complex stuff on him. His bow, or the way his shoes were made, etc. And he did that presumably without knowing exactly what day of the month it was or what month it was.
I think that part of this argument and part of the necessity of time has changed with the evolution of how cultures work. Knowing when to plant, and let's face it, it's agricultural, and the weather is, as we all know, having lived in Colorado for some time, highly unpredictable. So you could have a blizzard on that day in April or May when you typically what's the old adage is never plant flowers before Mother's Day. But that doesn't mean the day after Mother's Day you're not going to get a 12-inch blizzard, and all of your labors will have gone to naught.
That's right. And so I mean, as a farmer, you have to work from some experience to say this is the kind of season that we're having. I mean, that's why we had farmers' almanacs.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's another episode that was really funny was the Straw Hat Riot, which was itself funny because that's a calendar-based thing. You can't wear your straw hat after Labor Day, and people did, and they had a riot over it, right? But I mean, one of the things that they're talking about that is that when do you get a shift to a straw hat? When is it spring? And that's at the point that you can harvest strawberries. Those start harvesting earlier, and they're arguing over whether you're measuring spring by the south or the north, or this is like a fight over when you have to switch from your felt hat to your straw hat, and you need to buy a new straw hat every year. And I mean, this is all just stuff we make up. And important enough, though, that the people who wore their hat on the wrong day literally caused a riot in the streets. Because hat makers wanted you to buy new hats, essentially, is where the riot comes. So, again, it goes back to how much of our culture is designed around this concept. How much of it, how do we fabricate something as crazy as you wear straw hats now, you wear felt hats then, based on a calendar, when for thousands of years we didn't have a calendar that marks such things.
Yeah,
it's hard to imagine that, like in a hunter-gatherer society, they were like, all right, well, this is when you put on your this kind of fur, and if you put it on a day earlier,
and so I think we can all agree, Bigfoot does not care what day of the week, what day it is, right? Bigfoot presumably survives without having a calendar.
I have it on good authority that he does not even have an iPhone. So yes, that's now. Yeah, back to the point that it was that I want to expand upon just a little bit. It's like as our world has become more and more modern, and then also my reference to the nation of shopkeepers comment. But imagine a modern society in which you don't know which day you're going to get interest paid on an account. Quite a bit of the late 20th century was us finally putting together with a more or less, unified view of time was able to be leveraged into just-in-time supply chains, which was, one of the big business evolutions of the 80s and the 90s. When people finally figured out that, we have the mechanisms that we can take our understanding of, time down to the split second and make sure that when our factory runs out of part A, that a ship and then a plane or a truck arrives with part A, hopefully a few hours before the last of your previous part A's have been thrown onto the assembly line. In the scientific realm, the oscillation of atoms is, actually what makes the atomic clock work. And so we've used that as a definition. So I think that as societies become more and more advanced, the necessity of having a unified concept of time and one that everyone is able to easily understand. It's true we could run on 6 or 7 different calendars, but the potential for confusion, I think, is just too high, especially in a modern world where so much of the world is operating on a just-in-time paradigm.
It's in it because it still comes down to that same question, though: is it required because we had it? I mean, or would we have come up a different way without it? I mean, I think intuitively we would say it would be very difficult to do the complex stuff that we're doing if everybody didn't agree on the date and everybody didn't agree on the time. But on the other hand, we found that people are able to do things in strange conditions and do them very, very well. We built Apollo without the computing power that we consider necessary today to, buy our groceries. And so I don't know if you buy your groceries, but I guess people do on the computer, but you know what I mean. Is so that, necessity is the mother of invention or whatever, is to say, would we have simply built it all, managed to coordinate it all with a different vision, or is it absolutely necessary to the operation of society? I don't know. I mean, but I mean, we're wandering past here, even counterfactual, and you're really wandering into. I mean, is this a good science fiction story? What if we never agreed on a calendar?
It is interesting to think about on how that, because it does feel like in order for us to have developed the way we did, even from the point of, I mean, if we're talking like Bronze Age, that we had to come up with not just this idea of this is when the seasons change, but calendars, because banking really doesn't work without some idea of when you're paying. When you're doing interest and stuff like Brad mentioned, and if you don't have a pretty firm idea of how that works, then you don't have banks, and if you don't have banks, then you can't start leveraging the money that you need for essentially polities and then nations, and as we get to larger groups, I mean that's can they function if they don't
large
have that?
Complex civilizations operated off of lunar calendars. The Greeks did, the Egyptians did,
true.
the Mongols
that's
did.
True.
I mean, without us, carrying around a calendar. And
heck, the Babylonians were using the sexagesimal system.
Yeah.
For quite a lot. We can't even agree that we have 10 digits and 10 toes. So, or that this is clearly the superior way to measure everything is base 10. When every once in a while those crazy people who decided, oh, well, just count the number of joints in your fingers and you come up with 12. Therefore, 12 is the most logical and most natural way to subdivide
and
time.
you learn, I mean, we learned to count by tens, but you would learn just as easily to count by 20s.
But that's also, I mean, we have, the historical way that's all survived, that, despite that, we have 24-hour days and 60-minute hours. And, and that's all stuff that's held on from completely different systems.
And there's absolutely no reason you couldn't divide the hours of the day into 10.
No.
Or 20 or 50, however you want to do it.
I'm sure that would make the metric crowd happy.
Metric time, yes.
Could you imagine waking up one day and being like, there's new time?
We would have to teach all of our computers and all of our, but I mean,
right. Well, and that's code ends up relying on some of these ideas that we've.
Well, I mean, Y2K, which turned out not to be it's still funny to me that Colorado built a disaster bunker for Y2K. But I mean, Y2K is a wholly human manufactured device. I mean, that 2,000 years from was a totally, just throwing darts at a board at some point. And then
there was nothing different between December 31st, 1999 and.
Except that our computers were taught that the safe space, we only used 2 digits on the assumption that we were never going to cross over into a new century because we didn't understand our own.
At some point, someone said that's some future person's problem.
Yes. and then it got there. So, I mean, here's a question. So whatever, there was the proposal of the International Fixed Calendar, which was taken to the League of Nations. And it was originally adopted by the League of Nations, and it was eventually rejected by the League of Nations. But that was the idea of moving to a more scientific calendar that was not based on anybody's particular culture, that wasn't based in anybody's particular faith. So what if we in a world, that at the turn of the 20th century, had moved to another calendar? And just everybody agreed we're just going to use this now. I mean, the obstacles to it were all cultural. But I mean, was there a point? I mean, like you're saying now, it would be hard to move to a 10-hour day as opposed to a 24-hour day. But I mean, was there a point when we could have just waved our hands and said, let's do this, right? I mean,
it feels like we could have. It practically doesn't feel like it would be all that possible, because I think about the fact that they tried to, change. They tried to do this we're not going to do 80 BC, we're just going to do CE
BCE,
and BCE, and the idea that was just supposed to be that then it was outside of these religious conventions, and the amount of just honestly vitriol and problems that has caused makes me think that if we were trying to say, we're doing this because it's not going to be religious, you're going to have every religious person saying, yes. What the heck?
Well, I mean, that was the problem with both the International Fixed and the World Calendar. even though they both use weeks. I mean, you still did. It would just add, but I mean, so the concept there is because with the fixed calendar, every month is going to have 30 days, right? And with the world calendar, every quarter is going to have 3 months of fixed days. But they both come off at least a day off and 2 days off every 4 years, or roughly every 4 years, except on the ones that are divisible by 400. I mean, the math is still the same, and that was the problem, is that you got this one extra day, and that's not in the week. And so, how do you if you are supposed to, worship the Lord or recognize the Lord once a week as a matter of thing, then how do you what do you do about that one day? Which it seems to me that we could say, how about we just not worry about that one day? Because I mean, the Lord presumably had something to do with how long it takes the earth to go around the sun, right? If you're believing in that already. But one of the things that would have meant is that you would have had, and it works differently between the two calendars, but you would have had one day a year that essentially wasn't in calendar. Essentially, you either skip the day or you have 2 Sundays in a row or something like that, and that day would have been an international holiday. And every 4 years, it would be 2 days of international holiday that everybody agrees upon, that we all share because it's the nature of the calendar. And how would that change the world? If we had one holiday that was not a religious-based holiday, it wasn't when your daddy was born or anything like that. It was that extra day. I think one had them in July and one had it in January. But I mean, if we just had one extra day, that's just like, we got to have a calendar in order to get our stuff, where it needs to go, and that leaves us with this one day, and we're going to use that one day to party. Would the world maybe what was the movie where they have one day a year where everybody can commit crime or something like that, the purge or whatever? Maybe that's what we do on that day. I don't know. Is that a day when there's no morality? Is that all morality? Is that a day of giving thanks for all that we have, or is that a day to argue with your relatives? I don't know. But I mean, how if we had that one day and we all agreed upon it, would that change the world? Would that change the way that we do world politics or world events?
Well, and it does seem like there's a connection there. I mean, that's not to put too much on it, but it feels like that would bring the world together a little bit, because it's just this idea that it transcends our various cultural differences. I think that sounds pretty cool as kind of a symbolic thing. But it is and if that's what we're talking about with the calendars, is what that kind of stuff can mean to for not just what day it is, but can mean beyond that. I mean, I think that's the question of the Gregorian calendar and all the other ones is besides the fact that we have to, or if we have to use them to measure time, what do they say beyond that, and what could they say that they didn't.
And could it say here's a matter, because the way we do that now is we have some months that are 30 days and some months that are 31 days, and then we add an extra day in February that we don't do anything with the leap day, right? There's no big party on leap day. And it's funny because we will now, there's a holiday every single day of the week. I mean, it's ice cream sundae day, right? I mean, I did a whole episode on that too. It talked like a pirate day. And I mean, there's 3 different times that Pulaski Day is celebrated in America. There are 3 different dates where Pulaski Day is celebrated. One on his birth, one on his death, and one because it's just kind of convenient. Those days, I mean, we decided to move all our holidays to make them 3 days weekends, right? So, I mean, what is the meaning of Labor Day and Memorial Day when we've just said, we're not even going to fix the day on that. We're just going to say it's always going to be a Monday, so you get a 3-day weekend. So we're obviously able to be flexible on what we count as a day. So wouldn't it be more fun instead of just, we got 31 days this month and 30 days next month, one day a year to even things up, then that's party day.
Yeah. I think that would be, that's an interesting alternate future. And what would that day represent? The modern world, especially with, some of the things that are going on currently, you would hope there would be, perhaps an International Day of Peace or an International Day of Service or an International Day of Appreciation.
Yeah, a day of giving.
Yeah. And unfortunately,
hopefully it wouldn't be an International Day of War. During that day, nothing counts, and so shoot at each other.
Well, yeah, we can hope not. But, that actually a bit of a segue. Sometimes the differences in the calendars were genuine political and religious and political-religious hybrid conflicts. And the fact that again, the English were distrustful of this entire crazy thing
Mm-hmm.
coming from the Pope. It
Well, some other Protestant countries even more so. I mean, it took even more time to do it. Whether Sweden did something weird where they were trying to phase it in over time, or whatever. Newfoundland,
which did not work out.
Newfoundland, I don't want to pronounce that wrong, that decided to go one half hour off one daylight on the on the time zone. So they're at 30 when we're at, I mean, so I mean, these are all these weird conventions. But I mean, the fact that we do these conventions, that whatever Indiana could decide that they were going to all be on Central Time Zone rather than following the time zone line and all that. The fact that we can do that shows that we have the capacity to be. And think about it this way too. I mean, if we Star Trek it up here, if we build a Starship Enterprise and go floating off into space, right? Our calendar is totally based on the Earth rotating around the sun, right? So I mean, if we're parking on another planet rotating around another star, these days aren't going to make. When you look at the instruction, there's actually I found it. There's actually a script instruction about how they do star dates in Star Trek, and essentially they said is that this is nonsense. Just make sure you're consistent through the whole episode. That's what they say, because dates become nonsense whenever you're talking about going across at least multiple solar systems, multiple planets that are not all rotating around the same sun. I mean, a calendar would actually be kind of nonsense if you were on Mars, right? Because it's a completely different rotational cycle.
And yet probably
souls on Mars,
in
right?
the sense of kind of probably what we would end up doing is trying to fit that somehow into the system we already have.
We would say Earth is the pin, and everything is done in relation to Earth, and that might tick off the Vulcans or the Klingons or
Well, then you could have the literal appreciation of in the year of our Lord, in the year of the Earth, April 4th, 2722, henceforth known as Stardate, whatever I'm making up. And I think that's one of the things that is kind of interesting with this topic, I think, is that it proves that we hairless monkeys really, we just can't leave well enough alone. We want to discover and we want to quantify all of the universal constants that we can. And as we have developed through the years, from primitive civilizations all the way to, where we are now, just how deeply we look into those things. And then again, hairless monkeys being very irrational, how often does this turn to conflict? How often does this turn into a big to-do? Yeah. Whereas a more rational, perhaps a more rational species would just relax and go with the flow. There's a certain joy to that.
If we went with the flow, would we be a more rational species? Is this the nature of the species, or is this the species adapting to the environment that we've created?
Yeah,
because you could also theoretically live under the ocean or live, in a tunnel or a cave, where the seasons don't make any difference at all, where the length of the day makes no difference at all. And you could set, on a spaceship too, I suppose, you could set on any rotational cycle you want, right? You could decide, however you want to do it. We don't have to live on a 24-hour day. We don't have to live on we're only doing that because that has to do with it spin on the axis. But if you can't see the sun spinning on the axis, what do you care? So if we did an experiment, we put people underground and said this is going to be just an experiment for living underground, but we don't tell them, but we start slowly shortening their day, they would just adapt to it, right? So are we adapted to what we built, or did we build something that is part of our nature? I couldn't quite find. I really tried to find. Is there any example of like a true war, a battle fought over? No, it's Thursday. No, it's Wednesday. I couldn't really. For all the stuff we fought over, I couldn't really find anything that kind of came down to, other than there being some cultural arguments, with the Gregorian calendar and what that had to do with Pope Gregory. But it couldn't come down to us actually fighting a conflict over us not agreeing on the date.
Yeah, I was unable to find anything like that. And yet, knowing the background of some of the wars that have started over history, I am sure that at one point or another, especially during some period of history that's not particularly well documented, and I'm thinking specifically, early Middle Ages, that there had to be a situation where, Tribe A said, well, hey, we were expecting tribute on Tuesday, and Tribe B saying, no, it's only Sunday. And I can certainly see where, the irrational side of humanity that could cause certainly some conflict, and it probably has caused at least one altercation or so.
Yeah, I mean, it's
possibly some fairly big
cultures that use different calendars are somehow now stuck onto the Gregorian calendar, and there had to have been some at least tension over that at some point.
Yeah, there is if some other culture, say, and this is in terms of a counterfactual, of say China, hit was the one that found the Industrial Revolution, or did the colonizing and was running off of their calendar, would we have all just adapted to their calendar? Would they have found a calendar that was more like the Gregorian one just naturally, or would they have run off of the calendar they had because that's the calendar they had and the rest of us just needed to figure it out? Because that's essentially what happened with the Gregorian calendar. Is we all just said, you can have your own calendar, but you're gonna do all the business on our calendar, so we're not gonna learn yours.
Yeah, we're not gonna pay attention to when the Chinese New Year is, because you can, but you got to recognize when ours is, because everybody's got to know our calendar, right? So.
And that's how all our businesses and business quarters, and when the new year starts. I mean, there's stuff beyond just the fact that that's the holiday, New Year's Day, but there's also all these practical things.
And of course that's something that changed a lot over time when the new year started. It used to be the Ides of March. True. Actually, I was just talking about that the other day too. But so had we gone to like a Chinese lunar calendar, which actually is able to count days perfectly fine, if we'd gone with an Eastern calendar rather than with a Gregorian calendar, if that's the one that kind of took over the world, was carried through, I mean, would that change our culture? Would our culture look more Eastern? Would we be more likely to base our culture on Chinese thought than on Western thought? There's people today who argue the Western thought is, good or bad or whatever. But I mean, if we had chosen, or if we'd chosen a Hebrew calendar or whatever other calendar, do we lean towards Western rationalism and Western history and et cetera because of the calendar, or the calendar is probably evidence that we have leaned towards it? If we had chosen another calendar, might that be different? I could say from a history standpoint, if we were to do something like just switch, like they talked about doing in 1930, 1937. Already now, because of the Gregorian calendar, when you say something happened on this date, it didn't necessarily happen on this date, because the calendars weren't necessarily matching anything prior to when a country shifted to a Gregorian calendar. I mean, the point of the episode I talk about saying nothing happened on whatever September 5th in England that year. There were September 5th other places, right? So if you were born on September 5th, it doesn't mean that you don't have a birthday that year, right? So.
That is actually kind of funny that you could have been born on September 5th in Poland, but that in England that date didn't exist and you were born on a different date.
And what if you were born a year earlier on September 5th? Did you not get a birthday that year, right? I mean, it's just you did not count that year.
We jumped over that one. Yeah,
when is your birthday? So, but I can say from a history perspective, it would be harder to relate things if we decided to go to a 13-month calendar, which a lot of lunar calendars do, or stuff like that, to have counted one way for a long period of time and then make a switch, because how do you sync those up? But I don't know. How much does that really change history? Once Russia made the shift to the Gregorian calendar, which they only did after the Reds took over, then it moved the October Revolution into November. But how much does it make a difference that the October Revolution occurred in November?
Except that we called it the October Revolution, right?
But would history really be different? Would we really care if we called it?
Back to the English example. George Washington's birthday, because he was born before 1750. His birthday shifted, and so for a while they were trying to figure out, okay, so when do we celebrate George Washington's birthday?
when was his birthday actually? And that's that's it. To some extent, it shows the kind of silliness behind all of our our how specific we are with everything. Is that it just kind of reveals the absurdity of our attempts to make everything work the way we want it to. And if there's anything that seems to be about us as humans, it seems to be that we want to impose some kind of order. And I think that how and what kinds we impose differed depending on time period and necessity and culture and all that stuff. But ultimately, we're always trying to do something. We see a world, and in order to make it make sense to us, we want to organize it in some way. And that comes down to everything.
Complex environmental ecosystems operate entirely without caring what day of the week it is. Right, and that is an environmental ecosystem is as complex as a spaceship or anything getting stuff from Amazon on time, any of that we're talking about, and yet the plants somehow are able just to figure out by how cold or warm it is. Don't have to know what day of the week or what the month is.
They don't know. They're not necessarily looking up at the stars and even knowing.
They don't care about the stars.
The way that we know when the equinox is or the solstice. They figure out roughly around that when those times are based with information that we don't. And that's it's amazing to think that
yet they bloom year after year.
Yeah, and they.
Yeah.
Sometimes at the wrong times.
Yeah, I was going to say, however, you can get that, really long warm spell in January. The crocuses start coming out, and the next thing you know, Old Man Winter is back. The tulips always get me, is that they here you'll have a nice day, and all the tulips are like, boom, here we are, and then freezes every single one of them.
I mentioned the Great White Blizzard. That it turns out that Whitman had published his poem about the first dandelion of spring. It was particularly early spring, warm spring that year, and it came out the day that they had this huge blizzard hit New York and knock down all the power lines and freeze people. And that his poems in the newspaper going, the first delicate dandelion of spring. Everybody's
under 10 feet of snow.
Yeah,
and that's. Maybe that's we that irony could not have existed except for our
except that we make this stuff up. We decided to say.
Yeah, anecdotally, something that we were discussing earlier, they actually have done some studies where they have isolated people in very neutral environments, and I want to think that one that I had heard is that for some odd reason the humans would tend to synchronize on a 25-hour day as opposed to 24, which of course led to multiple observations that this must be because of aliens. Clearly, humans were seeded by aliens.
Right. Yeah, we came from a place that had a longer. That's interesting.
Huh. That's it's an interesting conversation.
Aliens can always be an answer. They can always be an answer.
Mm-hmm.
Have we done that test on a Bigfoot?
We will learn.
We don't know what his circadian rhythm is.
Is his rhythm different than ours? And maybe that's because either he or us are aliens.
Does Bigfoot sleep in?
Does Bigfoot sleep in, or does he get up with the sun? Does he have an alarm? Does some days does he say, "I'm just gonna take another 5 minutes"?
I don't know.
These are questions.
But hit snooze. It's an important question. That is to say.
How close?
Again, though, presumably Bigfoots and bears and birds and beavers don't keep a calendar, and yet they still go.
Animals migrate and they go into hibernation and stuff that does actually require some amount of being on time.
Yeah,
and they mostly
cicadas
manage
keep
it.
track of years somehow, right?
When they've got those cycles. Somehow they're making that happen. How does the cicada know it's been 16 years or whatever?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Someone actually might be able to answer that. I don't know if there's a scientist somewhere that knows how cicadas do that.
How they click it off. He's got a calendar. He's dug in his little hole and he's scratching stuff on the wall.
Or maybe they're like the deer and they all just are kind of waiting until half of them have decided. Half of them look around. I don't know.
All right, Bob's crawling out of his burrow. I guess I'll go too.
I guess it's time. Maybe there's just one of them that's in charge of watching the calendar, and so as they just wait for that one to come out, and they're like, "All right, okay, now it's time." And if that one messes up, everything is ruined.
Yeah. Now, I do like the idea of an international calendar. Perhaps that day, the bonus day that we get, that can be Groundhog Day, where we can celebrate another highly unreliable holiday.
That's true.
To predict what the weather is going to be like over the next 6 weeks. While in the background, "Here, hold my beer," and other comments similar are being made.
I would be interested just to hear what people think. Like in the comments, put down, if we had that international day that we're using, it's a one day a year that was in between because we got to a calendar. What would the world do? How would we celebrate that day? I think it'd be interesting to hear some of the very philosophies of how we should do that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Counterfactual History, and if you did, you can find lots more history if you follow the History Guy on YouTube. You can also find us at thehistoryguy.com, Facebook, Patreon, and Locals. If you want to hear more Counterfactuals, stay tuned. We release podcasts every 2 weeks.